And newly released documents are shedding light on how Jeffrey Epstein avoided serious jail time for 2 years. Transcripts from a 2006 grand jury suggest prosecutors knew Epstein sexually assaulted underage girls 2 years before he was offered a plea deal. Now an attorney for one of the alleged victims is calling the handling of the case atrocious. Let's bring in senior investigative correspondent Aaron Katersky for more. Aaron, what are you learning from these grand jury transcripts?
Diane, for almost 20 years, there has been this nagging suspicion that the grand jury initially set up to investigate Jeffrey Epstein was led toward a dead end, that prosecutors almost deliberately made their case in front of the grand jury so that Epstein wouldn't be indicted. And we don't have all of the facts and all of the presentations from this document dump, but what we do have is fairly damning because prosecutors almost subject the witnesses to interrogation. It's almost like victim shaming. They talk about the women as prostitutes. They talk about the women's drug habits. These are 15 and 16-year-old girls who were allegedly abused by Jeffrey Epstein, and yet prosecutors treated them, these documents show, as the criminals. And
the attorney for one of those alleged victims says it was almost like they were trying to prosecute these teenagers and ignore Epstein, suggesting things like, you're admitting to prosecution, to prostitution, and so on. How is the then state attorney responding to these accusations?
Look, this is sort of the origin story of how we got to where we are now, because the case that didn't really go anywhere leads to this solicitation charge in state court, and then eventually it gets into federal court where the deal is made to allow Epstein to basically skirt on most of what he's facing against the evidence that the Palm Beach police had amassed and thought Epstein should be prosecuted for. And then fast forward, 15 years later, Epstein's arrested, almost 5 years ago this weekend, before he dies by suicide in prison. And so all of this goes to, I think, clarify what many of the alleged victims and their attorneys have thought for years, that Epstein should have been prosecuted and could have been stopped at least a decade or more before the law finally caught up with him.
And Aaron, any response from the law enforcement community? Is it normal to say to a teenager who's coming forward with sexual assault allegations, you might be admitting to prostitution or other crimes here?
It's not a generational difference, but remember, Epstein was finally prosecuted in New York by the feds around the Me Too movement. So there's just been a whole sea change in how law enforcement and the public views sex assault victims. In many cases, victim shaming was probably, I don't want to say acceptable, but more the norm. Now we tend to look at perpetrators a little more differently. And so there is a legacy here of the Epstein case. It isn't great for the alleged victims at the time, but finally, I think prosecutors are treating these cases differently.
Epstein died in jail in 2019. So now what? What happens with this case?
There are a number of civil lawsuits pending. None of them are terribly satisfying for those who are looking for justice, but there has been a fair amount of money paid out over the years. Ghislaine Maxwell was successfully prosecuted. She is now appealing that conviction. We're waiting some kind of determination from the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. And there are, in the courts, still a few rocks to overturn to see if we can learn more about Epstein and what law enforcement knew. For example, the FBI. There's a case to try and get FBI files unsealed. That may take years more. Maybe we'll get eventually to the full and complete narrative of Jeffrey Epstein, but it's going to take a lot longer.
A lot longer for alleged victims who've already waited quite a long time. Aaron Katersky, thank you.